I think I saw somewhere that you referred to it as that government didn't encourage the previous transitions by putting a tax on horse shit.
I think the climate change community as a whole spends too much time obsessing about targets and not enough time focused on actions. What you don't want to be doing in a contested political situation is something that will be unpopular and ineffective at the same time. You know, that's not the best.
And yet we seem to be really good at that. Hey, y'all, we're back in the saddle. We took a bit of an extended break through August, and some of you may know why, but we're happy to be back. So come here to me, as my friends in Dublin like to say. We've got a great show. Back kicking off the autumn with Simon Sharpe, author of 5 Times Faster, who decided earlier in his government career that counterterrorism was boring and climate was a bit sexier, which we endorse. We're hoping to have him at our live show this Sunday, the 22nd of September at Madre in Liverpool, at the Labour Party Conference Fringe with our pals from Startup Coalition. I guess Simon thought his job with the United Nations was more important. Whatever. Going to be a great event, 1:30 p.m. on Sunday. If you're going to be in Liverpool, come on down. Fancy, but not so fancy. You need accreditation to be inside the secure zone. So we're going to get a great panel of special guests of founders and thinkers and investors, and Andrew Pakes, MP, the newly elected member from Peterborough, talking about what's needed for the transition. And delighted to say we're going to be joined by Christian Hernandez, 2150 VC, our first ever guest, coming back for a return appearance. But space is limited, and you first come, first seated. So probably the only fringe session you'll be sober for on the Sunday. But don't worry, I'm reliably informed the margaritas at Madre are ace. So come check us out. Been a weird few weeks. My interview with Simon will some tidbits exclusively for subscribers. Chris Clark at a recent conference, and also some, what do you call it, found sound from the Energy UK conference earlier this week, if you want to read ahead of the class and get ready for the weekend. And also there's been some US political events we might touch on at the end, but we'll save a lot of those for the triptych episodes coming up, featuring some insight about why climate and the IRA is the dog that didn't bark in the US election. Some stories from Texas about why that might be just fine. Last item, friend of the show Ben Cook of The Times is helping to organize the 3rd annual Times Earth Summit on October 15th in London, and we've got a sneaky way for you to get a discount early bird ticket if you stay on to the end or click on the link in the show notes. And now here's my chat with super interesting thinker and author of 5 Times Faster, Simon Sharpe. Welcome back to Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations. Today's guest is Simon Sharpe, author of 5 Times Faster, former climate diplomat, currently director of economics at the Climate Champions team, among other roles. His book is a groundbreaking call to rethink the approach, science, economics, and diplomacy of climate change. And we'll be discussing why we need to decarbonize 5 times faster, the pitfalls of reductionism and climate strategy, and actionable solutions for policymakers, companies, and citizens. Simon, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Richard. Great to be with you.
I mean, the book is. I went back to reread the book because it's such a tour de force, and it's such a pleasure to go back and see just so many different things connected. I mean, it's rare you're going to see a book, particularly in this space, where you've got Xenophon, the 3-body problem, and various other references and allusions, Schumpeter, that goes back to really challenging the thinking. But let's start with the title. I mean, 5 times faster. What is the significance of that for everybody, for those of us in the audience who hadn't read it?
It was a phrase that I found myself saying repeatedly when we as the UK were hosting the climate change talks in 2021, COP26, and we were doing all of this diplomacy in advance, mostly online because it was the time of COVID. We're meeting people from other countries' governments, trying to talk about how could our countries work together and make faster progress. And so as part of that scene setting, I felt, well, we need to have things in perspective. Let's all try and have the same idea in mind about how much faster do we need to be going. And so I looked at what's been happening with global emissions per unit global GDP. And I found that over the past 2 decades, that indicator had been falling as you would want it to, but only at a rate of roughly 1.5% per year. And I looked at, okay, in this decade, from 2020 to 2030, roughly how fast does it need to fall to be online for the IPCC's 1.5 degree trajectory, and I found it would need to fall at about 8% per year, so 5 times faster.
Right.
Of course, now we're talking more than halfway through 2024. Depending on how you count it, we've got about half of this decade left, and emissions haven't started going down yet globally in aggregate. So somebody needs to update that calculation. I haven't done it myself yet, but God knows what it is now. If you calculate it on the same basis, maybe it's 8 times faster. I don't know.
And I suppose it's something that, I mean, I worked on a project around COP28 that was, kind of working on some speechifying, which I can talk to you about sometime off the record over a glass of wine or something, to give you the body blows on it. But let's just say it was quite an eye-opening experience, and maybe actually changed career, because it was like really looking at things like that, the viability of the 1.5 degree target, that we talk about. That's coming under increasing pressure, even in public discourse. People now more openly talking about overshoot. I want to get more back into the book in a second, but I suppose since the writing and since all the data that we've had since then, and you're, kind of looking at things needing to be 8 times faster, um, are you optimistic that the 1.5 degree target is still useful as a valuable way of trying to guide our actions, or should we be rethinking that?
Well, I suppose a slightly sideways answer to that question is I think the climate change community as a whole spends too much time obsessing about targets and not enough time focused on actions. I think, you look at the temperature jump that's happened or seems to have happened in the last year or two. We probably don't know yet how much of that is a fluctuation and how much, if any, is a change in the trend. It certainly looks worrying. 1.5 degrees looks really, really hard to meet. But none of that changes the fact that we need to decarbonize as fast as we can. So I'd much rather not spend any time debating the targets and just spend all of our time and effort focused on the actions. What do we need to do next?
And I think that you spent a lot of the book, exploring the things that have prevented us from getting into those actions, and across the disciplines of science, economics, and diplomacy. And I think you end the book on very practical ways of doing that. Can you maybe just take us through, like, I mean, I love there was one line in the book that essentially you point to a 19th century French failed novelist, failed mathematician, failed something else, who then basically somehow invented an equilibrium economics that now infuses how we all, and particularly in people in hiring decisions in government, in academia, if you're not as part of the mainstream of that orthodoxy, it can be very difficult to get heard, because it just pervades the way that we think about that. So maybe just take us through, like, that first one, equilibrium economics. What is that? Why is it holding us back?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, this is a really strange story of the development of a field of knowledge, where, in my view, it took a wrong turn about 150 years ago for some really coincidental and accidental reasons, but has stuck down that path and surprisingly stuck to it very firmly. And as you say, it was kicked off in that direction by a guy who'd tried a few other careers and not been enormously successful, Leon Valras, and he really wanted economics to be a science, and he thought that to be a science, it needed to have maths equations, and of course, those equations needed to be solvable and to give answers. And he looked to physics and copied some of the equations from there, and uh, made whatever assumptions he had to make for those equations to be solvable and to give answers. And one of the important ones was this idea of equilibrium, the balance in the economy, the way that prices balance supply and demand. Um, and so he built up a construction of ideas and equations and assumptions around that. And he shared it with a famous physicist at the time, Poincaré. He wrote to him and said, "Look, I've done this great work to make economics into a science. What do you think?" And Poincaré wrote back to him and said, "Well, everything you've done is based on arbitrary assumptions, so it doesn't tell you anything. It's all meaningless. You shouldn't do it." But that didn't discourage him at all. He pressed on and he managed to set the direction of economics for the next century and a half. And uh, various reasons why we've got stuck to that. Some of them, I think, just inertia in an academic discipline. Some of them more political. After the Second World War, there were businessmen and philanthropists and politicians in America, particularly, who thought that a free market vision of how the economy works was an important defense against communism.
Mm.
And so there were geopolitical reasons for bolstering that particular view. And of course, it became even more dominant in the late 20th century with Reagan and Thatcher and so on. But what we have now, this is really, I don't want people to think that what I'm talking about here is political ideology. It's really at the basis of it an understanding of how the economy works. When you look at the economy out of your window, do you see a system in equilibrium where, according to my dictionary of economics, it's a situation where nobody has any reason to change their actions so that the status quo can continue? Or do you see a situation where constantly there's change happening and very often people have reason to change their actions and very often the status quo changes? I think when anybody, whether they're an entrepreneur or a policymaker or an activist, when anybody seriously looks at how the economy works, what they see is a complex dynamic system changing all the time, probably according to the processes and laws of evolution.
Mm.
And it's the maths of biology that we should have taken for economics, not the maths of mechanical physics. So why on earth does that matter? I know that's that's some big steps backwards. Let me take a couple of steps forward again. Why does it matter? Well, to take one simple example, the main prescription of economics with respect to climate change has been price the externality, make the polluter pay, have a carbon price. And importantly, the advice hasn't just said this is one good thing to do and you should do lots else as well. It's been stronger than that. It's been that this is the best thing to do.
Mm.
The most efficient way to decarbonize is to put a price on carbon. And that is only true if you think the economy is in equilibrium. If you accept all of those assumptions from the 1850s, then that's true. But if you think that actually, no, the economy is a dynamic system, that's no longer true. You have no reason to assume that at all. And in fact, when you think about the dynamics seriously, and you also look at the lessons from history, the technology transitions of the past, you realize more or less the opposite is true.
Mm.
That early in a transition, simply putting some price on the incumbent technology is not likely to achieve very much. It will be inefficient dynamically. And instead, you really want to focus on building up the new, investing in the new technologies and the new systems that will benefit from self-amplifying, reinforcing feedbacks. It means everything you do will be paid back double. That is much more efficient.
I mean, I think I saw somewhere that you referred to it as the government didn't encourage the previous transitions by putting a tax on horse shit, or something to that effect. So I think that's kind of makes makes the point in a colorful way. I mean, also when I was thinking about this static model or the equilibrium model rather, I mean, do you remember the Bill Phillips hydraulic computer, the LSE? This is the water computer that modeled the British
Oh,
economy
yeah.
right after the war.
Yeah.
A New Zealand-born engineer who developed this 2-meter high, set of tubes with different bits of water that meant, was basically exactly showing this a physical recreation of this thought about equilibrium as being the natural state of an
Yeah.
economy. And so I read your section on that with Walru, and I just thought, oh God, this is like the ultimate manifestation of that thinking crystallized in physical form, which we've been locked in ever since and has held us back. So that really spoke to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great way of thinking about it because in that sort of closed model of the economy, nothing new ever enters into it. And yet you look at how has the economy actually behaved over time, and as other people have written, one of its most defining characteristics is the entry of lots of new things over time. If you go right back to the beginning, the human economy in the Stone Age was a bunch of stones. We had a very limited product range back then, but the increasing diversity of products and services in the economy is enormous. It's absolutely exploded over time, especially recently, and it continues to do that. So modeling the economy as a system where nothing new ever comes into it is just completely unrealistic.
And so, I mean, it's something that I think the term reductionism is something that you use, and it's interesting to me. Like there are two ideas it seems like in the book that are sort of in tension, right? And I want to come to the diplomacy element in a moment because I think when you first start getting into this stuff, as you might have done, I think you allude to some anecdotes that led your thinking to change over time as you were in some of these roles in government, um, where on the one hand, people want to look for the simple total solution rather than break it down into the sectors or different pieces, the bits you can actually attack with solutions. At the same time, you talk about reductionism and the fact that if actually breaking things up presents us from doing system thinking. So how do you reconcile those two things? First of all, what's reductionism, and how should I think about having those two ideas in my head at the same time?
Yeah, you put that really well. What I mean by reductionism is the idea of, to understand a problem, you break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller parts. And so my background actually was physics. And in physics, one of the approaches is you look for smaller and smaller and smaller particles. And then you hope that if you find the smallest particle in the whole universe, then eventually you can build everything up from that and explain it all that way. Um, the problem is that in complex systems, the behavior of the system is actually different from the behavior of its components. You can't just look at the small thing and then extrapolate. And there's a famous paper on this called More is Different. The idea that at each level of complexity, you have to understand the system on its own terms. So, for example, you can understand the behavior of biological cells, but that doesn't tell you the behavior of an organism. And you can understand the psychology of a person, that doesn't tell you the behavior of the society. At each level up, the behavior of the system is qualitatively different from the behavior of its individual components. So that means studying these small individual things on their own is not enough. And that's very relevant to economics, because in this static model, static concept of the economy that we were just talking about, one of the assumptions is that you can think of a representative agent, a single person, and treat them as if they represented everybody in the economy at once. So you just look at what they would do and extrapolate that and assume that everybody does the same. And that really doesn't work, because the dynamics of the economy come about through the way that people interact with each other. This is why we have business cycles, boom and bust. You wouldn't get that if there was just one representative business and all of the others did exactly the same.
Mm.
It comes about through the interactions. So that's the problem of reductionism. It doesn't help you understand the dynamics of system behavior.
Right.
And when we talk about low carbon transitions, that is about system change, changing one set of economic practices, production models, consumption models, governance models for another one based on a different set of technologies. So for that system change, we've got to understand the system dynamics, not assume that we can extrapolate from the behavior of individual agents. Where you rightly, I think, point out this tension, and let's do come on to discuss diplomacy, but there I'm very much saying break it down. There's a principle that systems thinking doesn't just mean think about everything in the universe as being connected to everything else. That's a good Buddhist principle of interdependence, and I think it's philosophically absolutely right. But when you're doing practical problem solving, actually, step number one of systems thinking is define your system boundary. What's the boundary of stuff that you really care about that's really relevant to the problem you're trying to solve? And things outside that, sure, they're connected, but actually ignore them, at least to begin with, or else you'll never get anything done.
Mm.
So, system boundary. And the system boundary, when we're thinking about climate change, that boundary will be different depending on your level of governance. If you're a national government and you've got already the beginnings of a plan to decarbonize each one of the emitting sectors, then you definitely need to be starting to think about how do those things interact. What's your interaction between your power sector plan and your transport plan and heating and so on?
Right.
But if you're at the global level, we don't have a global government. And so an fully integrated global plan for whole economy decarbonization is probably too big a boundary to realistically take on. And if we could just get our shit together in one or two of the emitting sectors and agree how we're going to work together to decarbonize them more quickly globally, we'd be doing much better than we are now.
Right. No, that makes sense, and I want to dive into one or two specifics on that in a little bit. But let's talk about diplomacy because we wanted to come back to that. And you were part of the team that worked on, as you mentioned, Glasgow and COP26, but you were also um, part of the people who were helping to deliver. Not deliver, maybe too strong of a word, but certainly involved in the Paris Agreement, which I love in the book you describe as, I was going to get this right, the biggest public relations gamble in history. So given that, again, for me as a bear of small brain and people like me who go, well, surely we could just have some just one big global solution. We should all just be able to sign off on something, and everyone could be just we can go back to sleep and not have to worry about this anymore. But of course, we've been trying that for 30 years and it hasn't really gotten us far. So, what was different about Paris, and why was it the greatest public relations gamble in history?
Well, background to this is that for a long time, for at least a quarter of a century, the dominant idea in climate diplomacy was that we should look at the finite pie of global emissions, the carbon budget that is consistent with avoiding dangerous climate change, and divide it up. Let's find some way of dividing up that pie. And that will sort out the problem. And the difficulty with that approach, I mean, it's quite obvious, really, but that is too difficult. It's too large a scope to agree all at once. You think about that. What are you trying to do there? It's encompassing economic development across every sector of the economy, enormous uncertainties. Governments, especially early on in the process, but even now, many governments of many countries have no idea how they're going to decarbonize and over what time scale and how that will affect all the different kinds of things they care about. So it's too large a scope. And I think one of the lessons from the history of diplomacy is diplomacy only works when the scope is manageable. One of the examples I give in the book is to do with war and peace, that we don't anymore try and negotiate an agreement to
Can,
have world peace.
can I jump in for that? Because I mean,
Yeah.
I have never seen, and again, I love the phrase. When I first heard about the Kellogg-Briand Pact in my intro to IR class in 1989 or whatever it was, and and again, I think you're right. You write in the book that you've never seen anybody justify the Paris Agreement in terms of it being the Kellogg-Briand Pact being a good example. But actually, your take on it is fascinating. So just geek out with me for a second on the Kellogg-Briand Pact. What was that, and why was it important, and how did it influence your thinking about Paris?
Yeah, well, it was something I learned about in my history classes at school. In the UK, we always um, learn about the world wars, and this was a pact that came up in between the two world wars. It was in the 1920s when the memory of World War One was still fresh. Everybody thought it had been absolutely awful, and they thought it would be a good idea if we all agreed that we'll never go to war with each other ever again. And so there was this agreement, and countries agreed to renounce the use of war as an instrument of national policy. And most of the big powers of the day signed up for that, and they all signed that agreement. I think it was in 1928, and then of course about a decade later they had another world war even bigger than the last one.
Mm.
And so it wasn't enormously successful. And I, what I take from that is the scope was too large. It doesn't mean there's no such thing as a successful peace agreement in diplomacy. Of course, there is. There have been many examples of those,
Mm.
but just not one at that scale. Scope was too large, too difficult. I think you can say the same if you look at the problem of world poverty. We've never had an agreement to end world poverty, uh, and yet lots of useful things have been agreed. Development initiatives that countries have worked on together have made some progress. Similar, if you look at trade, there are some examples of global agreements, but not many, and it's very hard to do them at a level of depth. So, what happened with climate change when we set the scope that broad? Well, relatively quickly, we found out we couldn't agree a global deal to carve up the global emissions budget. I mean, you could say we found that out straight away. At the very beginning, there were countries that refused to put emissions targets even on the table for negotiation. They wouldn't have them discussed. But in another way, you could say, well, we took a very long time to accept that reality,
Mm.
that we kept on trying and trying. We had Kyoto and Copenhagen, and they were all chipping away, sticking with that idea and trying to get closer and closer to it. And perhaps Copenhagen and the meetings afterwards were a bit of a turning point where people began to realize this just wasn't going to happen. So what did we have with Paris? Well, the focus on national emissions targets hadn't changed, but the countries have virtually given up the pretense that we're going to agree them. So we said from now on, look, just actually do whatever you want. Set whatever target you like. You can decide it for yourself. The only thing we're agreeing to do is let's all tell each other what targets we've agreed. So in fact, we're agreeing not to agree.
Mm.
I say we've become collaborators in non-collaboration. The Paris Agreement is pure unilateralism masquerading as multilateralism. We're actually agreeing nothing of substance, it's only a process. And I liken it to imagine if the tax system in a country was a whole set of rules about when you write your tax return, how you fill it in, what color ink you use, but you can choose for yourself whether you pay tax or receive benefits and how much of either of those. So this is why I call it a big PR exercise,
Mm.
because many of the people at the time I worked on the Paris Agreement, people who were really pushing for it, doing everything they could to see it agreed, were saying this will send a message to the economy. It will send a strong signal for investment. It'll send a political message. Wait and see. Everything will follow from it. And all of that, it's a bit of an emperor's new clothes thing, because actually the agreement itself didn't really do anything of substance.
Mm.
So you're just hoping that everybody believes and thinks that it did. Now, in hindsight, it's still very difficult to disentangle to what extent has any progress since then been attributable to the Paris Agreement versus not. It's incredibly hard to say. You can't do that in the way that you can scientifically attribute warming to different levels of different greenhouse gases. You can pick it apart, and I think I won't try and go into that detail right now. But I think if we're being generous, we can credit the Paris Agreement and all of that process with helping to do some norm setting. And the norm of net zero targets has really caught on and spread very fast. And that's a good and helpful thing. But if we're being critical, we can say, well, look, global emissions are still going up. In aggregate, countries' near term emissions targets are actually kind of flatlining over the course of this decade. So this whole approach of focusing on targets, it's not getting us brilliant results. And in fact, there's every reason to think that if we concentrated on actions instead of targets, focused our diplomacy within each of the emitting sectors, and tried to reach agreements among the small groups of countries most influential in each of those sectors, then we could get much further towards the kind of deep emissions reductions and rapid transitions that we need.
And it's something that, again, both in the book and I think in your other work and the East Project, which I wanted to ask you about. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, surprising, I suppose, to someone not necessarily familiar with the detail of the level of collaboration, in particular between the UK and China. In terms of the exchange of ideas, and I've heard Chris Stark talk about this at length at various fora, where he talks about the interactions he has with his when he was at the Climate Change Committee, his counterparts in China, etc. And it's something that feels, I suppose it's a source of hope in the sense that even if you took the worst outcome possible for the election in November of the United States from a climate point of view, that the world is this kind of plurilateral, if you want, ways of different ad hoc coalitions of being able to find ways to collaborate, is a source of some interesting bright spots where perhaps dark clouds might obscure things otherwise. So can you say a little bit more about that and whether or not there's anything particular about the UK that gave it that role without necessarily wanting to put a jingoistic hat on it, but there does seem to be something particular about the historical experience that prepared the UK in a way that's different from a lot of other major powers and how they've conducted climate diplomacy.
Well, that's interesting. I wouldn't want to claim that the UK is too unique in that respect, because there's a really lively landscape of bilateral and in some cases plurilateral cooperation happening. I I think I've often felt, as having been a diplomat in the UK system, um, that we as a country do have quite an outward-looking mindset, and I think you can say for better or for worse, this may be a function of UK history and plenty of bad things. I'm talking about colonialism that we've done in the past. For better or worse, I think there is a legacy that within the UK, within government, within civil society, people do tend to look outwards and think actively about what do we do about some global problems and how do we work with other countries. Sometimes I'm sure that can come across as arrogance and naivety and misplaced ideas. Other times I think it can be creative and it can be
Mm.
helpful. Um, with with China, one of the most important things, I think the strongest part of the UK-Chinese collaboration is on the power sector, where obviously China's the biggest, and the UK is one of the fastest decarbonising and most forward-thinking in terms of future market design. And there's a really good history of cooperation there. Just to give credit to somebody else, I'd say California has had a long history of cooperation with China on road transport and on vehicle emission standards.
Mm.
And if you look at, why is China by far the world's largest market in electric vehicles now? It's largely because they copied regulation from California, to some extent also from the European Commission. So that cooperation also very quiet, very low key, very patient and consistent over time has really, really borne fruit. And I think often people don't recognize how much below the headlines, where countries are slagging each other off and having trade wars and so on, um, actually there's a great deal of trust between individuals and organizations and cooperation that does take place.
Yeah.
What I would make as an important distinction is that there's been a great deal of this kind of bilateral cooperation. If we really want to move the global economy quickly, I think we need a gear shift to go to much stronger plurilateral cooperation. And the reason for that is we're trying to move big global markets and move them quickly. In each of the emitting sectors, typically the top 10 countries make up about 3/4 of the global market, whether you measure it by production or consumption. And even then, you don't need all of those 10 countries. But if you have a good handful of them, coalitions not of the willing but of the influential, and if they agree with each other how to coordinate on some of the key steps, then I think we can move much more quickly. And this helps everybody else. It's not a question of everybody needing to be around the table and being somehow punished if they're not. Actually, everybody benefits if the big economies coordinate their actions and make the new technologies cheaper and more accessible to everybody.
Mm. And it's something, again, the technology piece, and I think focusing leverage, as I think as you refer to it in the book, on particular sectors and how that, can lever an entire, rest of the economy kind of solution. I was reading, I think, a paper in Nature Economics last week came out talking about I thought I was up to date on some of this stuff, even like talking to Jenny Chase from BNEF and how disappointed she was that her book only had 14 cents per watt in terms of solar PV costs, and now it's down to like 9.5 cents a watt. So she can't keep up herself with the crashing prices, and batteries seem to be going a similar type of direction. And so this paper looked at battery plus solar as being the cheapest form of electricity generation everywhere on the planet, literally by 2030. 2027 for most of the places except the Nordics and the UK, because offshore wind and onshore wind is still pretty cheap. But the staggering effects that's going to have, I just don't think I've really permeated the thinking around how this stuff works. And at the same time, we're now kind of drifting into a place where, well, actually, let's stick with the technology for a second. I want to come back to the geopolitical changes and whether or not you feel that we're headed into a good place or a bad place on this, what's going to enable collaboration, or whether or not the trade wars you mentioned are going to, kind of do for us in the end. But in terms of, let's expand a little bit more, if you could, about how, you know, smaller actors can have a bigger systemic impact on enabling key technologies. So, like, how do you do this? How can small influence the big? I mean, you talk a lot about this in the book, but how to accelerate an energy transition?
Well, I suppose um, how many people does it take to move forward the transition globally depends on the stage of the transition. Uh, at the beginning, hardly anybody's involved, and so a small number of people can have an enormous impact. And I think probably the best example of this is to do with solar PV, and of course you can look at it at any stage along its history. But I love to look at what happened in China. What were people saying round about the year 2008? And at that time, China set its first solar PV deployment target, and it was a target of 1.8 gigawatts by the year 2020. When it got to the year 2020, it had deployed 252 gigawatts of solar, 140 times as much as they expected. And that was outstanding. And I always think, well, if in 2008 you were there bullying China to set tougher national emissions targets, well, I was in conversations like that, and I know the Chinese would just ignore people or got angry with them. It didn't help. But if you were there helping them design their very first feed-in tariffs, or helping them understand the technology and how it could be useful, then anything you did at that point had spectacularly large effects. It had enormous leverage. For anybody who hasn't read Greg Nemet's book on how solar energy became cheap, I'd really recommend that. Gives a great insight into how different people can have a large influence at different stages in the process. Now, of course, when we look at the power sector, solar and wind being 80% of global capacity additions each year, things have really moved on. It's harder to accelerate the transition globally.
Mm.
You can accelerate it in different places. All kinds of people can help in their local areas. All kinds of different actors can make a difference, but it's hard for any of us individually to influence the pace globally. When you look at other sectors, there are many of the more difficult ones that are still at an earlier stage. If you look at steel, there are, depending on how you classify them, either 0 or 1, or maybe at best 2 large-scale plants for near zero emission production, primary production of steel
Mm.
globally. One of them, the most well-known one, is in Sweden. Sweden's not exactly a powerhouse of the global steel industry, but by doing this first demonstration plant, they've really helped move the transition on. So I think there's all kinds of opportunities for smaller countries to do that in the sectors where we haven't made so much progress.
And I think it was interesting. You get your focus, and as you go through, and you were very heavily involved in setting up things like the Zero Emission Vehicle Transition Council. So focusing on again, there's a particular kind of cascade of these different bits within the economy where decarbonizing, one can have an outsized impact, as you say, or even smaller actors, in the global system. So can you just take us through maybe a little bit about the sector specific kind of way, and looping back to what we were talking about, how you first were trying to avoid reductionism, but then we're actually telling to look at systems. We've got to look at these different pockets and establish the system boundaries that we're trying to actually affect. So why is it important? Do you think that the thinking that you helped to not necessarily initiate, but certainly help to get some impetus in that this way of thinking about the actions that could be taken, the solutions orientation. Do you think that we're continuing to make progress since you were writing this book in 2021, just on the blush of the success of COP26?
I think it's slow progress, to be honest. I think there are many initiatives that involve groups of countries trying to tackle practical problems on individual sectors. And there's now an annual report. This has been a thing since COP26. It's called the Breakthrough Agenda Report. It's led by the International Energy Agency. The UN high-level climate champions also contribute to it, and it takes in information from across the community. I'm part of that process as well. And if you look at those reports, then you see it says that there's potential for practical collaboration to make transitions faster, easier, and cheaper is far from fully exploited. And So if you take, for an example, I think the steel sector is a great one to look at when you think about the role of international cooperation, because it's such an internationally connected sector. And a vanishingly small proportion of it so far is actually near zero emission production if you exclude the recycling. So there's everything still to do. One of the difficult things is, how do you incentivize manufacturers to invest in the first facilities for producing near zero emission steel? This is a hugely risky bet for them because it's going to be more expensive and they don't know if there's a market. Um, if you could be a country like the UK and you can say, well, we'll guarantee you a market, we'll use public procurement or we'll use subsidy or something like that to make it worthwhile. But actually, we're not that big compared to a multinational steel producer that sells to a lot of countries. And they might decide, well, that's very nice that you're creating that market in the UK, but actually we don't care. It's still too risky for us. We're not going to do it. Whereas if you have a group of countries banding together who align their actions, whether through public procurement or subsidy, to create that first market, then the signal for investment is much stronger. The risks are lower. It's much more likely that the investment happens, and that makes it easier for everybody. There is a group of countries called the Industrial Decarbonisation Initiative that's just beginning to do that. At the moment, they account for about 20% of the global market. That's smaller than we'd like them to be. If China joined, it would be 70%, and that would be really, really serious. But also, if you look at, well, what actions have they actually agreed to so far, it's still incredibly tentative. It's really barely got going in terms of seriously looking at the policy steps that could be taken together. So countries don't have this habit of working together on the practicality of the problem. The experience of the last 30 years has really ingrained the idea that climate diplomacy is all about talking about headline targets. And so that is still the main focus each year when countries get together. And in my mind, that's really wasting the political capital. It's pointless having these arguments between global leaders about emissions targets when they really won't change them as a result of pressure from each other. You really ought to be using that political capital and that time and effort and resource focused on the really difficult practical problems, trying to agree coordinated practical steps. That will not be easy, but diplomacy is not about doing easy things. It's about doing the tough things.
And I suppose it's thinking about it in kind of abstract terms. It's, kind of, we can think about models and systems and everything else. But of course, if you're sitting in hypothetically Port Talbot, and I'm not an expert in exactly what's going on over there with Tata Steel, but certainly, it's these transitions have real world impacts, and I suppose that on people's lives as well as their expectations for the future in different communities. And I suppose it can naturally give rise to a certain amount of fear, a certain amount of backlash, a certain amount of saying, well, things are just fine as they are. Why do we have to change anything? Um, how do you think that we're coping with, now that we're seeing, various people for sometimes opportunistic reasons, or I'm not going to speculate as to the motives. Some of them I'm sure are very sincere, but looking at saying like, yeah, but do we really need to? I mean, in this country, we went through last year saying like, yeah, but we decarbonize faster than anybody else. That's good enough. The world should thank us, and we should we should give ourselves a treat and push back our targets for doing this, that, or the other. Maybe targets is the wrong word. I know we're not a fan of targets, but in terms of like the actions that we're going to be taken in terms of changing the incentives for consumers to move to heat pumps or EVs or other solutions here in the UK. That there's a sort of like, yeah, we're doing fine. It's not really a threat that I need to worry about. Like we're doing great. Aren't we grand? So where do you feel? Where are you sitting at the moment in your optimism or pessimism scale about whether or not we are taking on board you start the book talking about urgency and that we underestimate threats. Do you worry that we've talked ourselves into a little bit of a lull of saying like, yeah, we're fine now, isn't it great, solar's so cheap, everything's gonna be fine, we don't have to worry about it?
I think probably not. I mean, I do think that there's great scope for climate change risk assessment to be done better in a way that makes the threat far clearer than it currently is to government leaders and to everybody else. Even so, I don't think everybody's quite as complacent as you were asking if they might be. But I think the reality is that technology transitions are always contested. There were always people whose interests are for them to either not happen or to happen as slowly as possible. And of course, that is the case with the low carbon transition, which is in fact a whole collection of technology transitions that have to take place in parallel. And so I think while one really important thing that we have on our side is that the costs of clean technologies are falling very rapidly, certainly a core set of them, and that should be making things easier. At the same time, one of the things against us is that so far we've tackled the easier parts of the problem. You can do quite a lot of power sector decarbonisation without consumers really noticing at all. They don't have to buy a different product. Nothing has to feel very different from them. You can get to electric vehicles being something like a fifth of the global market as they are now, with most of that being done by richer consumers, except in China, where that's not the case. And all the other sectors, we haven't really gone that far yet. And so we're going to be encountering more difficult problems where either as in heating, there's more disruption of people's homes or really tangible difference for them in the technologies they're using and the way those behave, or in industrial decarbonization where you get much more closely into the problems of trade and jobs, or in agriculture where again there's trade and jobs, but there's also food security. So let's not expect these things to be easy. These are going to be very contested. What I think matters in that context for governments and also for activists is to choose very carefully where they intervene. You do have to choose the points of leverage. And in fact, um, coming back to one of the things we talked about right at the beginning, the difference between taxing the old and investing in the new, well, this is obviously crucial for the political economy, and that's something that's long been recognized, but still could be acted on more strongly than it is. A few weeks ago, I was talking to a government on the other side of the world that's planning to use carbon pricing as its dominant policy for decarbonization.
Mm.
You know, how is that really going to work? How is that going to help farmers shift to a new model of agriculture that is zero emission? I have no idea. And what you don't want to be doing in a contested political situation is something that will be unpopular and ineffective at the same time. You know, that's not the best.
And yet we seem to be really good at that, of finding ways so we can insist on policy one way or the other that winds up being both unpopular and ineffective. So are you hopeful that we're going to ever learn some of these lessons? I mean, are given the kind of very, I don't know, very great tumult we are in the moment globally in terms of, we head in the right direction. What are you looking for? What are you hoping to see in the next year that would give me some comfort that we're making progress to be on the right track?
Well, I do take hope from the fact that in two transitions, power and road transport, we've made enough progress for people to begin to see how that's happened, how it works, and to start replicating the general principles of that approach in the other sectors. And so I suppose three things I'm hoping to see in the current year. One is global power sector emissions starting to go down instead of up. I think that's about to happen. The reason it hasn't happened yet is demand keeps growing, and it only starts going down when the clean technology chunk of generation exceeds demand growth. But it looks like that's about to happen. This will be the first one of the global sectors where emissions really start going down instead of up. And I think that can be a turning point in terms of confidence. It can tell everyone, look, actually, we do know what to do. Emissions are a lagging indicator of change, not a leading indicator, but this can work. Second thing is in road transport. Right now in the UK, there's a huge sort of media campaign against electric vehicles. The Daily Telegraph seem to hate them, and every day they publish some misinformation trying to tell people that sales are falling or stalling. It's completely untrue. The latest figures showed a 10% year-on-year rise in EV sales at the same time petrol car sales are falling. So I very much hope we'll see that momentum continue despite the trade tariffs that are coming up on Chinese EVs from the US and Europe. And I hope what we'll see is increasing Chinese investment in battery manufacturing and in car production in European countries and in the US. Just like happened with Japanese companies when we were all scared of them back in the 1980s. Third thing I hope we'll see progress on is steel. Of all of the energy-intensive industries, none of which have made much progress in the transition so far, I think steel is the one that's on the brink and could really be pushed forward with some significant policies in the US, in the EU, and some other countries. So I hope we'll start seeing the first investments in commercial scale zero-emission steel production, supported by the serious sort of policies that will be needed to make that happen.
Well, I think you've been very generous with your time, Simon. We really appreciate it. So I know I've actually kept you a little bit over time. So thanks for being generous with that. So is there a sequel going to be coming out anytime soon? Or is your UN work and your various academic posts keeping you too busy to come up with a new volume?
No, there won't be a sequel. No books for another 10 years.
Okay. Well, but where can people continue to follow your work? Where's the best place they can continue to see? Because you continue to publish, you continue to do other things that are not necessarily in book form, but where can they keep tabs on things that you're thinking about and writing about?
Well, thanks for asking. There's a website I created for the book, which has a lot of other materials on it as well. That's at 5timesfaster.org. And there will be another website in a couple of weeks' time for a new NGO that I'm launching, which will be very much focused on the economics of the transition. The organization is called S-Curve Economics, and the website will be scurveeconomics.org. Doesn't exist yet, but in a couple of weeks' time, it will do.
Well, this will go out, I think, right before the Labor Conference, which we were hoping to get you at. So I know that hopefully by then we'll be able to tout it from the stage and get other people to look at it then. But in any case, we look forward to that, and we hope you can come back. This has been a great conversation. I felt like we just scratched the surface, and there were so many things that I wanted to ask you, but I ran out of time. So Simon Sharpe, author of 5 Times Faster, Director of Economics, the Climate Champions team at the UN. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
If you're hearing this because you're not a subscriber yet, which is why you're not going to hear the exclusive content with people like Chris Clark, Delevan, Claire Coutinho, and various thoughts about what's happening in the US at the moment. But, you can always fix that by going to wickedproblems.earth. But for now, over to you, Theo.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps others find the show. For an ad-free experience, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll get our newsletter, show notes, and exclusive content. Wicked Problems explores the intersection of people, politics, technology, and capital, and whether it creates a future you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delevan, with production assistance from me, Theodore Delevan. Special thanks to Sun Charmer for our phenomenal theme music. Thanks for listening.